Let's go. Severe testing, 1, 2, 3. Severe.
several times. Just test 1, 2, 3.
Testing, testing. 1, 2, 1, 2.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It's just gone 9:30, so it's time for me to resume the hearing sessions as part of the examination of the Dacorum Borough Local Plan. First of all, can everybody hear me? $1 million question. Microphones are working. Welcome back for those of you who attended yesterday, and welcome along for those of you who this is your first time at the examination. My name is Matthew Birkinshaw, and alongside me is my colleague, Mr. Thomas Bristow, one of the appointed inspectors to carry out the examination. Also in the room today is Louise St. John Howe, who's the programme officer. You'll have been in touch with Louise, no doubt, already, but Louise is here all day today. Should you have any questions, queries about the examination, documents, the library, or any of the sessions, please do get in touch with Louise. I think looking around the table, I think most of you probably were here yesterday, but there's a couple of new faces. Yesterday, we did have some IT issues, not in the morning, randomly, the morning was fine, but we did have some in the afternoon. So I know the council's been working really hard to try and resolve those issues. I think maybe one of the problems was interference. So no doubt Louisa spoke to you already, but if I can just make a sort of announcement to remind people, I think if people sort of turn their phones off or onto flight mode, I think there was an interference between people's personal hotspots and mobile phones and the interference on the microphones. Now, the importance of that is the microphones need to be clear so that people watching the live feed at home can hear us or speak, because without the microphones, they can see us, but they can't hear us. So it's just another sort of plea from me. There are some Black Tower plug-in things on the desk as well, and if people can use those to plug laptops, iPads, etc., and rather than trying to use the ones in the floor, that's something else that IT have asked us to do. So if you can use the extension leads on the desk, and again, if just whilst you're in the sessions, obviously we'll break naturally as we did yesterday. But if people can sort of turn their phones off or onto airplane mode, just so there's no interference, that'd be greatly appreciated. As I have done on other days, I could just start just by asking the council to run through any fire and emergency procedures whilst we're in the chamber, please.
Thank you, sirs. Let's just remind everyone we're not expecting a fire alarm today. If one does go off, it's a voice alarm system rather than a traditional siren. It will announce that the building will be evacuated due to an emergency. If we do hear that alarm today, everyone must immediately leave the building by the nearest available route, which is through the double doors here and down the stairs in front of the council chambers. The alternative route is to the left of the lifts. Please follow the fire marshal. And if you do need assistance in the event of fire, please make reception aware. The main assembly point is Market Square, which is just outside of the forum and across the road, and follow the main high street to the square. Toilets within the building, they're located to the left after the stairs, and also by the cafe on the ground floor. Just to note again that the hearing sessions are being live streamed and recorded to be made available after the session. Please be aware and leave the council chamber if you do not wish to be filmed. So again, just a reminder for people with regards to the microphones, hopefully they will work, but just remind people that if you do wish to use the microphones, it is simple: press the right button to turn it on to speak and press the right button again to turn it off. There should be a light at the top of your microphone to indicate when it is on. That's everything. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just before we go around the room and introduce ourselves, I'll just sort of run through a couple of quick housekeeping points from our perspective as well. So yesterday we talked about matters of legal compliance, we talked about duty to cooperate. What we didn't talk about yesterday was the sustainability appraisal, and that's primarily due to the council's consultants' availability that would normally sort of sit within day one. So for this session this morning, we are returning to sustainability appraisal under matter one, which is legal compliance. However, it does fit quite nicely in with the other topics we're talking about today. So patterns of development, spatial distribution, site selection, etc. So it does sort of fit quite comfortably together. So what we'll do is, I think most people here are probably here for some of the latter matters. What we'll do is we'll cover sustainability appraisal first. That'll probably take us up to a sort of mid-morning break, and then we'll move into the other matters. And I think probably site selection methodology would probably, I'm looking at Tom here, who'll be leading that session, will probably come after lunch, I would think. But we'll see how we get on in terms of time. I think SA will probably take us to the first break, and then we'll look at some of the sort of spatial distribution matters thereafter. So that's sort of roughly how today's going to work. Again, just a bit of a sort of a health warning from me on emission sites. I recognise lots of faces around the table. I know you've participated in these things before, but for those of you who haven't, it's not our role to determine the suitability or otherwise of emission sites. We're here to look at the sites that are in the plan. Now, today is probably the day where some of the cross-references and examples to emission sites emerge the most. We're talking about the site selection methodology. Mr. Bristow and I clearly want to hear your views. We want you to participate, but please, we're not going to get into my site's better than theirs. That's not what we're here today to discuss. And certainly in terms of sustainability appraisal as well, we're not here to sort of delve into the absolute detail of whether a site scored a double red or a double plus, or however the essay started to score things. We're here to look at some of the strategic matters, and the key, as I said yesterday, key for us are soundness matters, soundness and legal compliance. That's what we're here to consider, and it's the soundness and legal compliance of the submitted plan. As I said yesterday, please participate. Put your nameplate on the end if you want to come in at any stage. They are public hearings, but please do stick to the points that you've made in your representations. It's not an opportunity to start jumping on other people's points or making points that you've not made. That's in the interest of fairness to ourselves and also the council. It's the points you've made in your reps. That's what you're here to discuss. Any matters arising yesterday from the council that we need to be aware of? We sort of talked about the tech and things. Fingers crossed, seems to be working. Yeah. Happy? Okay, as we've done on other days then, if I start with the council, if I could just ask everybody to go around the table, introduce yourself to us and to other participants around the table. Just let me know who you are, if you're acting on behalf of a particular residents group or a particular client or developer, and the particular points in today's session or this morning's session that you want to focus on. That'd be great. So start with the council, please.
My name is Craig Howell-Williams of King's Council, representing the Local Planning Authority.
Morning, everyone. Ronan Layden, Head of Strategic Planning at the Dacorum Borough Council, overseeing the new Dacorum Local Plan.
Good morning, it's Mark Fessy. I'm a consultant with ACOM and I led on the sustainability process for the local plan.
Hello, my name's Anthony Hardridge. I'm from Bragg Berkhamsted Mist Action Group. We're interested in the whole process, but in particular in this instance, settlement of hierarchy and sustainability appraisals.
Hugh Siegel, also from Bragg, as Mr. Harbridge has said, the same thing.
Jacqueline Vita, representing CPRE Hertfordshire. The main bit I'm here for is the bit later on, probably the settlement hierarchy.
Morning, Jonathan Chitt from Nexus Planning, representing Crest Nicholson. We're here to discuss sustainability appraisal and spatial strategy later on.
Good morning, I'm David Churchill, partner at Carter Jonas. We are representing Crowd Ace Homes, principally interested in reasonable alternatives, settlement hierarchy and spatial strategy.
John Bell, Eco Burco, here to observe the sustainability assessment part. Thank you.
Hello, Helen Reid from Lambeth Smithhampton, here representing Plato Estates, who have land interests in the borough and are interested in developing sites for older people.
Good morning, David Murray Cox of Turley, on behalf of Dacorum, primarily interested in the settlement hierarchy, spatial strategy matters.
Good morning, Rhett Flashman from Fakem Homes, here to discuss both on matter 1 and matter 2.
Good morning, Melissa Murphy, King's Council, representing Dacorum and covering the sustainability appraisal matters contained in the hearing statement that we submitted.
Thank you. And if I can just not introduce myself, but mention one thing. As I said at St Albans, Mr Fessy and I encountered each other working in a similar area about 15 years ago, just saying that for openness. Obviously haven't kept in touch since and won't talk about the plan outside the confines of this hearing. Just mentioning that for openness. Can I ask if, so I heard who was here to participate. Is there someone here at the back for the Open Spaces Society at the moment? Are they coming later? Okay, just so I know in terms of when we get on to other matters. Okay, thank you.
Just one other housekeeping matter. Louise did ask me to say this and I instantly forgot. There are 2 Wi-Fi connections. So again, obviously we ask people not to use personal hotspots because of the interference. But in terms of the Wi-Fi, there are 2 Wi-Fis. I'm using the guest Wi-Fi, seems to work fine. Seems to be pretty good. There is another one, there's a DBC conference, and there are some sort of slips that the council's handed out with passwords for that one. So if for whatever reason you're struggling with the guest one, which does seem to work fine, but if you are struggling, there is another Wi-Fi option. And again, even after that, if you're struggling, the council's team obviously here, and also Louise is on hand. So as we break, if for whatever reason you're unable to get online, please do just say, and someone will hopefully help you. Right, so sustainability appraisal then. Again, we'll work from the matters, issues and questions. I think there's 5 questions or thereabouts on the sustainability appraisal. And Mr. Bristol and I obviously have read all the statements and we'll take those as read so we don't need to go through them. But we do want to just explore some of the issues, and these are again issues which have been raised by representatives. The first question really in the MIQs, I mean, questions 1 or 2 are quite similar really. But if we look at the sustainability appraisal work, and I want to start by looking, rather than sites, looking strategically at the level of growth which the sustainability appraisal tested and the council considered. We talked a lot yesterday about the housing requirement and the plan period and how the housing requirement would be increased through a main modification to 17,272, I think off the top of my head. Just talk us through, as by way of introduction to this topic, how the sustainability appraisal grappled with the overall level and quantum of housing development that was proposed through the plan and the reasonable alternative options that it considered. So sort of high level, sort of scale and quantum of development to start with.
Thank you, sirs. So I think it's a fair and reasonable question, and I hope that the following is helpful. I think the first thing to note is it's an iterative process, and you'll be aware, and you've made reference to some of the interim SA reports and appraisals. Obviously, this process has been ongoing since 2017, and we've prepared SA reports at each stage of Regulation 18 public consultation, and they form part of our evidence. They, as a whole, kind of contain the story of how needs as well as alternatives have been developed and appraised. Importantly, it's had to have regard to other evidence. So in talking about the quantums, obviously, I think the first thing is it's naturally always takes account of where we are in our position and where we are nationally and what the expectation is of plans and authorities with regards to housing needs. We feel that's appropriately reflected within the SA and the iterative and the interim essays also. I think just to add on that then, that's the top-down approach, as I understand it. You know, what's the starting point? And then there is the second part is the bottom-up approach, which is the sites and what sites are capable of meeting needs. And that too has been an iterative process carried forward over many years as well, culminating ultimately in the SA report that we have today in terms of CD 03.1. I'll pass over to Mark Fessy just regards to particular points on this, but ultimately, you know, this has been considered, you know, in light of that, the top-down, bottom-up, and then with that, the development and creation of growth scenarios and appraise those. I think personally, I think it's incredibly comprehensive, the process, when taken from 2017 to where we are today. And it's been refined over time in regard to the likelihood of sites. And I think the sites within that, are sites we feel are reasonable. In my opinion, I'd probably maybe coin it as being the ones that have the greatest potential, theoretically, to contribute or to be allocated. Again, subject to the process and subject to the consideration of constraints and any other matters, including infrastructure. But if it's okay, I'll just pass over to Mark Fessy now.
Thank you. Yep, so to begin with the process over time, so I'll starting with the most recent Regulation 18 consultation, which I think was 2023. There were 12 reasonable alternative growth scenarios at that time, defined on the basis of a process, and I'll talk a bit more about the process in a minute. And those 12 scenarios vary significantly in terms of total growth quantum. At that point in time, the highest growth scenario would have allowed the housing requirement to be set at about LHN over the course of the plan period. That's LHN as it was understood at that point in time. So in 2023, we actually ruled out as unreasonable what might be termed higher growth scenarios in absolute terms. So more specifically, scenarios where the supply would potentially enable the housing requirement to be set at a level above LHN. So that work from 2023 and the consultation responses received then fed into our work to define reasonable alternative growth scenarios for publication and representations at the Regulation 19 stage. So that process of really refining the reasonable alternative growth scenarios ahead of Regulation 19 is set out across Section 5 of the essay report that's in front of us now. And that Section 5 is a lengthy and involved section that works through a process. It's summarised in a flow diagram at the start, so it's figure 5.1. And just that flow diagram coming in from the left-hand side is a box saying context, because just to reiterate, work, appraisal and consultation from Reg 18 was a key input. Then the process, and Ronan's already touched upon it, was of defining the reasonable alternative growth scenarios ahead of Reg 19 was really a process of considering the top-down strategic factors alongside bottom-up, site-specific and detailed supply factors. And really marrying those two things together, that's actually sort of the penultimate step in Section 5.4, which is a key section, and then arriving at our conclusion on the reasonable alternative growth scenarios for Regulation 19. And we arrived at 10 reasonable alternative growth scenarios, those ones in front of us now. And again, they vary significantly in terms of total growth quantum, and they're broadly in order of total quantum, not precisely, but broadly. And the lowest growth scenario in front of us now that we consider reasonable at the point of publication was the total supply would be insufficient to allow the housing requirement to be set at LHN, as we understood it to be at the time. And the highest growth scenario, which is scenario 10, the total supply would be sufficient to allow the housing requirement potentially to be set modestly above LHN, as it was understood at the time, at the point of publication of Reg 19. So that's how the scenarios in front of us now vary in terms of growth quantum. And then finally, just to say that it's that the top-down consideration of strategic factors. So that's basically the first step in the process. It's Section 5.2. Section 5.2 split up under two subheadings. Firstly, quantum. Secondly, broad spatial strategy. So focusing on that first heading, quantum, that is the key section where we take a step back and basically discuss the numbers that are feasibly reasonable, lines to without getting lost in the weeds of detailed spatial strategy and supply options. So under that quantum heading in Section 5.2, there's actually a conclusion subheading to that subsection. And within that conclusion, under the quantum subheading, we basically say that, yeah, at high level, there are arguments. Well, really, the default approach nationally has to be setting the housing requirement at LHN over the plan period. But at a high level, in Dacorum, it's long been thought to be the case, and at the point of Reg 19, we still thought it to be the case that there is a high-level case for a housing requirement below LHN, so generating unmet need. Also, there is a high-level case for a housing requirement above LHN. And we summarised three key factors, which I'll touch upon, which I'll just conclude by listing I think it's three key factors. We say, I better go to that paragraph at this point, and then I'll stop talking. So the paragraph in question is, here we go. Yeah. So it's paragraph 5.2.32. So this is that high-level conclusion on the numbers, really. With regards to high growth, i.e. setting the housing requirement at a figure above LHN when looking across the plan period as a whole. The conclusion here is that while such scenarios were ultimately ruled out as unreasonable in 2023, there is now increased strategic argument for exploring such scenarios. The next paragraph then goes on to say, this is particularly on account of unmet needs, but also noting the government's direction of travel at the time of writing, September 2024. And by that, I basically mean pro-growth in a nutshell, as well as a possible question mark regarding the plan period. I expect we'll go on to talk about that, so I won't elaborate. And then there's a final sentence, which I don't need to dwell upon. But yeah, so that's the summary reasons for our top-down thinking about reasonable broad quanta options at that point in time.
So, obviously, I appreciate you weren't here yesterday, but we spent a lot of time yesterday talking about the housing requirements and the plan period. And you have no doubt seen from the council suggested changes to the plan. And it was confirmed yesterday that there's an acceptance that the plan period should be 2024 to 2041. You know, this is a pretty basic maths, results in a higher housing requirement over the total plan period. What was your position on all this? Because is it the case then, because you appear to be suggesting that you were aware of this? It seems to be some you refer to question marks over the plan period. Just talk to me about what your position was as you know, as a consultancy carrying out this essay, and why you refer to question marks over the plan period, and then ultimately what you did about
that. Yes, so our base assumption was that the plan period would be 2026, 2041, because that was the plan period in the plan as published at Regulation 19 stage. But we acknowledged across numerous paragraphs, which we're happy to take some paragraphs, we acknowledged that there was an argument for a longer plan period, so specifically a plan period starting 2 years earlier. And the implications of that sort of alternative assumption regarding the a longer plan period would be that the LHN, local housing need figure, would increase by 2 years, but also supply from completions in those 2 years, so 2024 and 2025, would also come into the mix. So that understanding was in our minds when developing the reasonable alternatives. So just briefly, in an early section of the report, so on like page 2 or 3, there's a subheading called section 2.3, I think, titled the plan period. 2.4 titled the plan period, and that's an introductory section. That's the first point where we say we have our base assumption about the plan period, but we also recognise there's an alternative possibility. Then across section 5, which is that long section about defining the reasonable alternative growth scenarios, again, we're very clear, base assumption, but also this possible alternative assumption. So that was in our minds. It was one of the reasons, I've already said, it's one of the factors that influenced our decision to explore higher growth scenarios all the way up to growth scenario 10. And it's just equally that alternative assumption, so the base assumption and alternative assumption was in our minds when appraising the reasonable alternatives, which is section 6 of the report, and also appraising the plan as a whole, which is section 9 of the report.
So if you look at the situation we find ourselves in now, you tested higher growth figures up to growth option 10, which when you carried out the essay, you were basing it on the plan period and the requirement in the plan. So you tested a growth scenario that was higher than the housing requirement in the submitted plan. Now, if you sort of fast forward to the position that we're in now, there's an acceptance that that figure's wrong and that the housing requirement needs to be 17,272. So have you not gone back then, and I guess it's a question for both the consults and the council, have you not gone back then and considered, given that you had some sort of question marks around the plan period anyway, the criticism from representatives is going to be, well, you effectively haven't considered any higher growth options because the housing requirement now effectively represents the higher growth option that you considered. So you haven't considered a higher growth option when you look at the housing requirement at 17,242 or whatever it is. So how is the council, going to respond to those criticisms? How do you think you sort of square that circle around, you've done this essay, you've tested higher growth, but it was predicated on the wrong figure?
Thank you, sir. I'll do my best to answer that point. It's a complex one, but I hope that the following is helpful. I think the first thing to note is obviously the essay, where it's at for the Reg 19 stage, is a point in time. That is necessary and is needed there, and it's needed also on submission. I think from our perspective as the council, is there sufficient discussion and appraisal of the higher growth option, or the option that responds to 17,272, the requirement of 17,272. And I think we felt there was sufficient discussion and appraisal within that essay report, having regard particular to the references Mark has made, i.e. the plan period was discussed, and the case and discussion for an extended period was discussed. I think the subsequent references within section 5, I think it's clear in reference to also table 5.5, clearly presents the alternative plan period scenario. So that is presented there, and we can see in that and recognize that scenario 7 has a shortfall in terms of land to meet that identified requirement. And when we submitted this plan, we obviously submitted this plan on the basis that we felt that, it could progress and it was sound at the point of submission. We recognize that, even as part of the examination process, some modifications are possibly there and they could be swift and easily addressed, but that the plan fundamentally is still sound. But when we submitted this plan, we did recognize that there was a shortfall in terms of, land identified to meet that requirement. And that's consistent with the discussion and narrative and appraisal and conclusions in this. And I think there are some of the kind of key points. I think, does the essay contain the information and the discussion sufficient to inform our position where we're at today? I would say yes, it does. Is there sufficient there? And it's consistent with the discussions we had yesterday on some of these matters, unmet need. With the amount of land identified to meet that requirement. There were matters discussed as part of that, and it's all set out within this also, in terms of the kind of the appraisal of the plan and the scenarios. And I think revisiting scenarios, if I can on that, it's probably just, without going too much into sites, but the bottom-up approach on this, looking at the sites up, suitable, available, achievable. We need to be reasonable in the sites here. I think looking around the room, many of the people here today, promoting sites and omission sites, the majority of those are considered within those, reasonable alternatives. And for any that might be there, I think the numbers aren't really going to substantially alter as a result of that. So they're just a few of my points right now, if that's okay. I hope that's helpful. Mark, do you have anything you wish to add? No.
Can I ask, and this maybe is a silly question, I see there are some references in the sustainability appraisal, but the council's reasons, the council's rationale for choosing or electing to progress with scenario 7. Can you take me very specifically to where those are set out, either in the essay or elsewhere? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So just being clear and succinct, section 7 of the report sets out the council's approach to the preferred option on that. And with that, it does consider in particular, and that delves into a little bit more detail, just having regard to the contents of the essay as a whole. So it's paragraph 7.1.1, and it spells out the council's position on that. Note that scenario 7, in terms of how it performs against the various essay objectives, we recognise it performs less well in terms of number of homes, so we reflect that to be delivered, but the option still meets, we do say there at the time in full, the housing needs, but that is at the point in time, when we, went out to Regulation 19. And we also made reference to, some other notable scenarios, particularly ones that seek to deliver higher growth. And I'm sure we may want to discuss those in a little bit more detail, but I'll leave that for you to ask, set questions on that. But we've had, consideration in terms of, particular elements coming to our view. I think green belt we've been very clear on has been important in some of our decisions. Landscape also, as well. But we do recognise, and I think the appraisal is highly objective on this. So, I hope that's helpful. As I said, section 7 is where we set our approach and how we consider it against, some of the outcomes of the appraisal and the other scenarios considered.
Yes, so is there anything, and this is just for my peace of mind, is there anything else? So that's very helpful. You mentioned 7.1.1. Is there anywhere else that people would go to find the justification behind the council selection of scenario 7, or is that it, if you like?
I think in the context of the essay and just being clear of the legal requirements of the essay, that is where it is set out. And we made reference, I think, to other evidence yesterday within the core documents, changes to the spatial strategy and site allocations. That's outside the range, but, the two are in some way intertwined.
And that's CD 10.6 that we'll come on to later. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So just going back to the sort of preferred approach, and again, just keeping it high level without getting drawn into sites just yet, is you discussed yesterday that in January 2025, you were well aware that the plan period was an issue, and the housing requirement was going to have to change. And we talked about the meetings you had with neighbours. At that stage, then, obviously, your essay, as I said before, your essay is very much predicated on this option 7, scenario 7. That's a preferred approach. It talks extensively about that, but it is nonetheless still based on what is now the incorrect housing requirement. So at that stage, did the council go back? Because what you said yesterday is, well, we're not going to mop up the gap with any new sites. We've lost appeals of being planning permissions granted. The gap will narrow, and actually, by the time we come on to talk about this in stage 3, there may even be a surplus. So has the council, because that's now your strategy. Your strategy is, what you're saying is, housing requirement goes up. We don't need other sites. Permissions, etc., will sort of mop up the difference. Have you gone back then and actually tested that through the sustainability appraisal? Because that strategy isn't the strategy that we sit here and look at in the sustainability appraisal. So did the council between, I don't know, say Christmas and March, did you go back and speak to Mr. Fessy and his team about actually testing that? Because that is the, as it stands today, you haven't got an essay of what would be the plan, because it's different. So did you go back and essay it, and if not, why
not? There were discussions and about the council's position as we were heading towards submission, and trying to seek some comfort that it needs to meet the legal requirements. And we felt there was enough content and context and discussion within the essay, as set out in just what I said a few moments ago, that gave us sufficient confidence on that. We did, naturally, and going back, in discussion yesterday, we talked about unmet need and made reference that we did consider it We felt that we didn't need to look to our neighbours. That was one option. And I think naturally we do need to reconsider it. And we did look at the context of the SA report and what it said about higher growth scenarios in the context of some of the representations made in terms of sites, other sites, and the information that we submitted, which, you know, we summarised reasonably well, I would say, effectively within our Reg 22 statement and Appendix B. In light of all of that, yeah, we still felt that there was sufficient evidence there. And I would say it in the context of when we submitted this plan, we still need to submit the plan as set out, CD 01.1. That is what we submitted, and that's what we considered to be sound, and that was the point at the time. And if there was anything, it could be, you know, quickly remedied, as part of the examination process. And accompanying that, we set out what we thought was helpful, you know, proposed changes or suggested changes to the plan. And that would be subject to this examination. And I think that we set that out in our response to one of the final questions of the Matter 1 MIQs about the status of that document and those proposed changes. And that is there to be part of the discussion, but ultimately no decision has been reached on those modifications, you know, to the plan. That's part of this examination process. And again, yesterday, in light of that, we've also had discussions about, well, there's still a lot more discussion with regards to sites. What sites are in the plan? What sites, you know, may change? What, you know, sites, you know, may need to, you know, either come out or otherwise, depending on the outcome of this process. So it's about when is the right time to essay this. And you know, the council says within the context of everything this was, there was sufficient discussion about it that says the plan is still submitted, the same sites are in there. You know, in terms of what we put forward as proposed changes, include a reference to the fact that we feel this can be accommodated. We still ultimately feel this plan, the strategy, and what it's seeking to do in terms of needs is still sound in the context of the framework as a whole.
So what you're going to be faced with is, you know, let's, you know, we agreed yesterday that there needs to be a main modifications to change the housing requirement. So you'd have to essay the main mods anyway. So presumably the council would turn around, as you know, you've alluded to there, you know, we would essay the main mods, so we would essay the housing requirement at 17.272. We would do that. It's an iterative process. We can do that. What the sort of this half of the room will probably say is, well, if you go and essay that at main mod stage, you've sort of closed your mind because you're that far through the examination process. You've sort of closed your mind that the strategy is an appropriate one. And what you should have done is, knowing that the housing requirement was wrong and knowing that there would be a shortfall, gone back and essay different options. So can we sort of mop up the surplus with sites? Are there any other, I don't know, permissive windfall policies, for example? Is there another way? Is this still the appropriate strategy in light of the higher housing requirements? How would you respond? So probably know what's coming. How would you respond to that?
Again, personally, I would keep this, you know, simple and to the point, and without repeating myself. You know, much of the discussion yesterday was around the basis that we still felt this plan was sound. It was consistent with the framework, and you know, having regard to, you know, the point when we submitted the plan, and having regard to, you know, the evidence within this. You know, we felt that this was sufficient to inform the council's decision to submit the plan. We have reviewed. We naturally would have a due process to review. You know, and that's, you know, important. You know, before we submit, we need to make sure that there is no significant issues, you know, raised through that you know, might fundamentally mean this plan is unsound. We didn't change the plan. We didn't change the strategy. We didn't change the sites. One of the points of the SA and what it determines with regards to commitments and windfalls is that it's treated as a constant in the appraisal, insofar as it cannot say or do much about them. And everything with regards to the appraisal is about the sites, the allocations. They are the variables that inform the appraisal process. So when we are submitting a plan and suggesting we still feel it's sound in light of updated commitments, in light of, you know, those commitments and those permissions coming through windfall allowances. With regards to the discussion and the narrative in this and the numbers element, the SA can't really say much more on those points because they are treated as constants. It does make reference within paragraph 2.4, I think, of the SA. Particular, if I can just go back on this, so with regards to the plan period and the discussion on the plan period, 2.4.3, a significant amount of development already has planning permission and will come forward in the early years of the plan period, also stretching into the middle and even later years of the plan period. And as such, the role of the local plans to identify new supply on top of supply from permissions, also a windfall assumption. And that's here, is that the, that is the role of the SA to consider, and appraise the variations between those reasonable options. So insofar as what more this can say with regards to that, it is unlikely that, any further work is going to say anything other than, well, these are the updated completions of commitments, and that will need to be fed into the mix alongside the discussion on sites and allocations, which is the subject to further hearing sessions later this year. And I would say on behalf of the council, it's appropriate that if we SA, it's right, we need to SA it. But it's the right time when to SA that. Is it in the context of we haven't discussed sites, alongside our supply? We talked about, the potential for an earlier review. We said we're mindful of that discussion relative to discussion on sites and supply as well. So in my view, it's appropriate that we have the discussions as part of this examination, agree the modifications, hopefully all going well, that should be consulted on, and absolutely SA it, and update the SA and the iterative process to that point. But to appraise something, that takes account of updated commitments. It won't add value to the appraisal itself, which is around the allocations and then where they are located and the contributions they make towards the various SA objectives in the framework.
Okay, thank you. So I'll open this up to any comments then, just dealing with some of the growth scenarios first. Yeah, Ms. Murphy.
From the exchanges this morning, it's it's clear to me that you're both excuse me, you're both alive to the points which were raised in our hearing statement, which in turn, of course, responded to your questions, reflecting your thinking at that stage. And so I've planned my submissions, quite short submissions, on the basis that that would be the case. So what I would intend to do is provide a really brief summary of the background, and then just look at the sustainability appraisal. But just to give the punchline now, the inevitable conclusion, which I think we've sort of got to already, is that the work's not presently fit for purpose. It would need to be revisited, and that is tacitly, perhaps even openly, I think, accepted. But the issue with that, the issue with what seems to be in mind, is exactly what you've said, which is that what seems to be contemplated is a sort of 10 to midnight sustainability appraisal report, and left to that point, it becomes an ex post facto justification rather than a proper evaluation of alternatives at the appropriate juncture in forming choices. So that's the concern. You've articulated it, and we share it. So just a quick methodical background check then in terms of how we've got to where we've got to. As you know, the sustainability appraisal is dated October 24. That's our CDE 3.1. And in terms of what it is considering, 1.3.2, so CD 3.1, 1.3.2, it's an appraisal of the plan and reasonable alternatives. So the plan as submitted as has been, as Mr. Layden said. If you look at just then in terms of the detail of what did that mean? Well, for example, the plan period is 2.4.1. 2046 to 2041. And so it's absolutely clear when we then come on to the scenario testing that the selection of scenarios was on the basis of a 26 to 2041 plan period. Now, I suspect you don't need to turn to it, but I've just got partly just reminders in my notes of then what happens. So we've got core document 1.1. So the submission, the plan has two policies giving housing figures. So we've got SS1 and H1, both they're 15,332, aren't they? Yeah. So we know that, we don't need to turn to that. And then we've got CD 10.8, which is the schedule of changes. Page 3, SS1 gives the figure of 16,043, and ditto H1, so that's page 6. So those are the sort of basic numbers that we're dealing with. But sticking with the essay, so we've got that in the background, sticking with the essay, and then looking at the scenarios. If you would go with me to page 44 of it. You should have a table. You should have a table there. Table 5.4. Do you have that? Yeah. Okay. That is in a section of text on under 5.5 of reasonable growth scenarios. But the table, the relevant table, is 5.4. Okay. And the reason that that is important, we just come to. So table 5.4, the reasonable alternative growth scenarios, assuming a plan period of 26 to 41. I'm emphasizing this because you can see that scenario 7 is 15,332. Okay. And we can note, just sort of moving away from the detail here, but we can just note that clearly had that been drafted in a world in which we were looking at 16,043, that scenario it would have been looked at completely differently. You wouldn't have picked 15,332 on the basis that it was the right or a reasonable number if you are actually looking to meet 1643. So that, I suppose that is why you've got to start with tacit and then open acceptance that this all needs to be revisited, because clearly that is out of date. So scenario 7 is 15,332 on the 26 to 2041 period. And actually you can see that explained in 5.5.7 below. There is I just noticed in the questions that there's a reference to the subsequent table. That is an alternative plan period scenario. And that is looking at the 24 to 2041 plan period. And that is transposing 16,043 to scenario 7, isn't it? And that's why there's reference to, well, we've considered it. So despite the date of the report, it was contemplating it's not certainly contemplating an alternative, but as we come to see, when we get some analysis, when we get some explanation of the reasons for the version selected, And it was a balanced decision, so it kind of said the specific reasons are then important. Well, we'll see what then happens. So there's an appraisal summary which is quite helpful on page 64, 6.17, the appraisal summary. Remembering that it's the table 5.4, so in other words, say scenario 7 is our 15,000 odd. And at 6.17.2, we can see the context there set for the appraisal of the various scenarios, acknowledging that that assessment's not weighted, and the weighting of all the various factors then comes in the subsequent section. So it's teeing up section 7 to be really then very important, having scored the various scenarios. And we can note, and I would say this, wouldn't I, but I'll say it nonetheless, that scenario 8 is obviously performing well there. And so when we then look at section 7, you asked, Mr. Rust, you asked, where do we find the thinking in terms of the options assessment? And it's really section 7, page 66. And the first paragraph tells us that the text has been provided by officers. Okay. And it's making the comparison of the scenarios and assessing the alternatives on the incorrect, now accepted to be incorrect basis that scenario 7 meets the housing needs requirement. And even on the council's own case, that's not correct. So if you look at the reasoning, scenario 7 performs best or equal best against 8 of the 15 sustainability objectives. It performs less well in terms of the number of homes to be delivered, but the option still meets in full the housing needs set by the current standard method. We note that scenario 8 also performs reasonably well against the sustainability objectives and is also ranked first under 8 topic headings. The key difference between these two scenarios is the inclusion of East of Berkhamsted in section 8, scenario 8. This brings added benefits under the accessibility heading because the strategic urban extension to the east of Berkhamsted, in addition to South Berkhamsted, which is assumed under all the growth scenarios, would or could deliver a secondary school. There's landscape and air quality constraints then in the next. And then if you look at officers' note, the preferred scenario 7 still performs well on accessibility, and the comparative difference in terms of housing supply is not so significant as perhaps is reflected in the appraisal scoring. We'll just come back to that point in a moment and then cut to the final paragraph, cut to the chase. It's sustainable development, but that's based on meeting need. Just remind you that in that table 5.4, scenario 8 was 16,332, and scenario 7 was 15,332. Sorry, scenario 8 was 16,332, and scenario 7 was 15,332. So that's table 5.4 on page 44. So having looked at all of the detail of that, what I would say is that a key plank of the analysis in terms of the selection of the alternative was, on an unbalanced decision, was whether the option met in full the housing needs set by the current standard method. which is obviously not now said to be right. So I want to just draw all that to a close by just going back, please, if I may, to our hearing statement. And when you have it to page 13, we tried to help by just giving the practical bits of the relevant case law. Importantly, the Save Historic Newmarket case, we refer to give you the citation for in 2.43, and we think the right bit in 2.44, and just again wanting to give you the punchline in that. The important proviso in terms of the reasons for the selection of alternatives, that the reasons for rejection are still valid if there's been any change in the proposals in the draft plan or any other material change of circumstances. Also, case law says that it needs to be in the essay itself. And that's 2.46. We emphasise that. So there's, as matters stand, there's a process problem, but we would also be concerned about there being a substance problem too. Because really, and just then just to conclude then on this, the reasoning doesn't hold water post change of circumstances, as you've seen, and was obvious to you. The essay clearly wasn't contemplating a higher housing figure in the text, explaining the reasons for the selection of the alternatives included in the plan. And if you look at the council's hearing statement on this, we can look at it now. I just give you the references, but if you look at 3.3.5, we would say that the justifications for scenario 7 don't apply now, and what underpins some of that reasoning will need to be considered very carefully through the remainder of the examination process. We would think that the real answer is in 3.3.6 of the council's hearing statement, and that's really what's come out today. And I won't repeat what I started with, but I'll just remind you of our concern about that ex post facto process.
Just on that point, because the council can, through this process, obviously we'll come to look at sites, and looking at the strategy as a whole, there may well be some sites, we don't know, not considered them. Let's say there's some sites that are either deleted, changed, enlarged, made smaller in some way, shape or form, and the council would have to essay those. I understand the points about, yes, the council should have done this and, after the horse is bolted and all of that. But from a legal perspective, what would be the risk for the council doing that? Because the council has a plan, they've submitted it for examination, they've essayed it. There will be changes to that plan. We've talked about one on day one. What the council is saying is, well, yes, we will mop all those up and then we will essay those changes. So we will have considered through the sustainability appraisal process, regardless of what stage it comes at, we'll have sort of done that requirement. We'll have essayed those changes. So the plan that ultimately the council adopts, let's say go through this process, the council comes to adopt it, we've essayed it, we've done our bit, thank you very much. What's the risk there to them doing that rather than us directing them to go back now and say, hang on a minute, there's been a material change in circumstances here. Before we go any further in looking at sites or strategy, you need to sort of go back and consider this and consider whether it still is an appropriate strategy and sort of almost rectify all the points in the essay that you've just identified. So what's the sort of legal risk to the council just doing it at the end of the process rather than us directing them to sort of say, no, you've got to go away and do it now? Because they could go away and do it now and presumably just come up with the same conclusions. But we've essayed it. We've essayed the housing requirement 17272. But all the conclusions in our sustainability appraisal still hold true. There aren't the sites out there that are appropriate, in our view, in the council's view.
Yes, yeah. Well, this is a process requirement. And ensuring that you have if you like, a fair assessment of alternatives and that you are documenting that thinking at an appropriate juncture is crucial. And so it's not for me, clearly not for me to advise the council. It's got its own advisors, and we will look at whatever it is that happens next, because there clearly will need to be something that happens next. So, that obviously that's quite an important point for me. So the detail of what's in your mind in terms of assumptions about the analytical process and the juncture at which it would come would be very important, but it's obviously not for me to interrogate what you're thinking in that way. I mean, I think so that's probably as much as I would wish to say about that. But in terms of what we have now is not fit, clearly not fit for purpose. I think that's tacitly accepted, and we would be wanting to ensure that there is a fair evaluation of reasonable alternatives at appropriate stages in the process.
Did you want to come back on any of the points? I just feel like we've discussed it anyway, but is there anything else you want to pick up in particular?
I won't go over the ground. I hope that our position is pretty clear on that. Again, just to reiterate, the notable references, table 5.5, the fact that we have considered an alternative plan period, that was considered, with good reason within the document at the time. But there's, I think, one other point, if I can pass over to Mark, please, just with regard to the process of appraisal of scenarios and whether with regards to homes, there's one particular one which considers homes, and whether that would be different, if in terms of the outcomes of the process, and then the consideration of the alternatives, which include, again, the majority of sites and omission sites we're considering to be included in the plan. But would it change the outcomes of the plan when considered against the updated housing requirement?
Yep, just quickly to reflect